every possibility exists as a parallel universe, a reality where you missed the train or never existed at all. Well, this isn't just science fiction, it's a possibility arising from our deepest understanding of the cosmos. So, welcome back to The Fundamental Why, and I'm your co host, Sahid.
And I'm your other co-host, Carrie, and I'm excited to announce that today is a very special episode. It's the first episode where we're going to have our guest speaker join us on stage. So, everyone, give a round of applause for John Wang.
Hello, and thank you, Sahil and Carrie, for that warm introduction there. I am a local science enthusiast, as well as a founder of a STEM nonprofit called Minds in Motion, aimed to help kids be inspired to pursue STEM careers in the future.
So thank you so much for the introduction, John.
Thank you for having me.
Hear more of you in our discussion section.
Sounds good.
So to move on to our theme introduction for this episode, as you might remember, last episode we talked about the end of the universe. And even before that, last episode, we were exploring the birth of our universe. So now in this episode, we're going to the next logical question. Is our universe the only one? This connects with our main theme of epistemology, which, as you guys know, is about knowledge and the knower. And specifically, we're asking, how can we know about if the multiverse is true if we can't see or even interact with it?
Okay, and so we've chosen to tackle the multiverse because our current theories for our own universe suggest that we may not be alone. And it is the ultimate consequence of taking our physics to its logical conclusion.
So to give you guys a rough episode overview, we're focusing on famous Swedish physicist and MIT professor Max Tegmark's levels of the multiverse theory. He categorized the most popular multiverse theories into 4 levels, level 1 to level 4. And level 1 is the most basic, most intuitive one. Level 4, the hardest to understand and the one that has the most assumptions. And we also have our philosophy section where we delve into self-identity when there's doppelgangers of you in parallel universes and Occam's ratio. So we're going to move on to our current proposed theories and ideas section. So to start off the current proposed theories and ideas section, we're going to start with level 1. So level 1 is the quilted multiverse theory, and it's the simplest and most intuitive one. There's only 2 main assumptions that you guys need to know. So first one is that space is infinite. There's no beginning or end, it extends infinitely. And the second is that there's only a finite number of ways that matter can be rearranged. So because there's only a finite number of ways, those patterns of matter are bound to repeat across the infinite space. You could think about it like a big blanket or an infinitely sized quilt, where there's only a finite number of patterns that can be on the quilt. So that means the patterns are bound to repeat somewhere else, maybe really far away, but it's going to repeat. This isn't new physics, it's just statistics and probability. So what this means is that there's going to be almost exact doppelgangers of you, or even exact doppelgangers, because your pattern, your configuration of matter is going to repeat somewhere else in the universe. And it's going to be really far away due to probability. And that's why the different universes in this infinite space are grouped into, well, they're separated and they're their own volume called a Hubble volume. And we're only separated by space, so given enough time, we might be able to come into contact with these neighboring universes and multiverses.
Okay, so that was a great explanation of the Quilted Multiverse, Carrie. And now I would like to move on to our second, I guess, level on this hierarchy. That is called the inflationary multiverse. So I guess the first thing we need to know is what cosmic inflation is. And we covered that term in our previous episode, the birth of the universe. So just as a recap, um, cosmic inflation is when there was this rapid burst of expansion of the universe in its very early moment of the Big Bang. And so I might ask, why is this important and what does this mean for a multiverse? Well, it turns out that um, physicists think that perhaps inflation never actually stopped. Well, it appeared to have stopped in our region of space and it created our universe. Well, um, elsewhere, we would see that inflation keeps on going almost endlessly. And so, as inflation continues, we'll see small patches of this space just randomly stop inflating, just like our own patch. And so when those patches stop inflating, we'll see bubbles being created, uh, and these are what we call bubble universes. Um, and they're similar to our own, but they might have different constants, like for different gravitational strength, or even sometimes even atoms may not exist in these bubbles. So they're very unpredictable in that sense. And so I want to leave you with the idea of imagine cosmic landscape. Okay, so we just have space, empty space, but then bubbles are just randomly being created as inflation just stops. But these bubbles are getting separated, but very quickly because of inflation, so we can never actually detect them. And this is what we call the inflationary multiverse. And so you might ask, this sounds like so bizarre. How do we ever even think of this idea? Well, it turns out there are mathematical models that physicists use that can hint at this. The same math that tells us inflation is true also tells us that potentially called eternal inflation, the idea of inflation going on forever, is also something that can be real.
Thank you for the inflationary
Yeah.
multiverse explanation, Saho. And now we're going to move on to level three. We're going to go up a step. So just a reminder, the farther up we go, the more complex the multiverse theories become. So level three is the quantum many worlds interpretation. As you might guess from the name, it relies on quantum mechanics. It basically states that at every single quantum decision, the universe splits, it branches off. So if you guys know about the double slit experiment and where scientists saw electrons at a wall with two slits in them, in our universe, one electron might have chosen the left slit, but in another parallel universe, the electron would have chosen the alternate option, the right side. So this basically relies on the concept of superposition and something known as the wave function. So in our universe, the wave function collapses, but in reality, it might just branch off into parallel universes. And one key thing to note here is that these parallel universes, they're not just separated by something like space, they're in a completely different realm altogether. There's no way for us to come into contact with these parallel branched universes. And it's something coined by physicists as quantum discoherence. We will never be able to meet, interact, or see another version of our own universe in where another decision was made.
Oh, that was like an interesting explanation of, I guess, the quantum multiverse, right? With each, I guess, quantum event, the universe keeps splitting. Well, I want to move on to, I guess, our last and final, I guess, tier, which is the fourth level of Tegmark's um, multiverse theories, and this is the mathematical universe hypothesis. And of course, this is the most abstract, so I'll try my best to explain, I guess. So, first, I this is what Max Tegmark proposed. Okay, we all know that the universe is governed by mathematics, right? Our mathematical equations predict a lot of things. Well, imagine if the universe isn't simply described by mathematics, but it is mathematics itself, right? Like that doesn't really make sense to us because we usually think of the universe as made up of forces and particles. How can equations or numbers be something physical, right? We can't really see them. Well, let's first break that down a little bit. Um, Max Tegmark, what he says is that any mathematical structure that is internally consistent, meaning that it's free of paradoxes, contradictions, or any logical flaws, let's assume the logic holds up, then that mathematical structure corresponds to a real universe. So, in other words, we're saying that the universe is programmed by the laws of mathematics. Maybe not our laws, because our laws might not be like there might still be flaws in our own mathematics that we're developing, but let's assume there is some sort of mathematical structure that is absolutely correct. Okay. And whatever that is, that corresponds to a universe. Okay. And you might ask, what is like a mathematical structure, right? But think of what we made as math, right? Like we have geometry, algebra, probability. They all kind of connect together in this coherent and logical framework. But maybe another mathematical framework may not even need numbers. Like there could be a different way of counting things, right? It's just hard for us to imagine. Maybe I can never ever imagine it, but it must exist out there, right? And so whatever that, but provided that it's logically consistent, that would correspond to a different universe. And here's a quick analogy I'm gonna give you. Imagine we have a video game and characters in the game. Well, imagine if they have a consciousness, let's assume, they would experience just a reality. But that video game is not just described by code, it is the code itself. And so imagine if we change the code, we can make a new video game, right? And then the characters would have a new reality. But of course, one thing must hold. The code must not have errors, or it's not going to run. In the same way of how our universe runs on the laws of mathematics.
So that was a really great explanation from us from about the level 1 to 4 of Max Tegmark's multiverse hypothesis. And now we're going to connect back to philosophy, of course. So the first idea that pops up when people hear about multiverses, doppelgangers, copies of you is about self-identity and ethics. So what does self-identity mean when there's an exact copy of you down to like the exact cells, the DNA, the choices made? What does that mean for your own identity? Do you share the exact same identity as the other version of you in another universe? And this also connects with some like free will, because if I make a decision in this universe and in an alternate universe someone makes the other decision, does that mean I even get to choose my decision if every single outcome is realized somehow, some way in the multiverse? So it really contradicts with the idea that we get to choose our own destiny, our own fate, and that we're unique in a sense. And if you think about it further, it also connects with ethics, because what does it mean if another version of you in another universe does a moral injustice? Does that say anything about you as a person? Are they two different, completely separated things? Or can that moral injustice and its consequences be applied to you as well?
Wow, I thought that really does bring up an ethical dilemma, right, Carrie? Like when you have multiple versions of yourself doing different, I guess, decisions. Wow, that's something I guess really important to think about there.
Yeah.
And I also want to raise something called Occam's razor. So for those of you who don't know what that means, it's kind of like a guideline. Let's say we had two scientific theories, and they both explained some phenomena with equal accuracy. Then Occam's razor says we always choose a theory that's the simplest, right? And that makes sense because we want to reduce any errors that can happen in science, right? Or right, because if we have two complex theories like that, that's just a bit unnecessary. So how does it connect to the multiverse? Well, critics of the multiverse feel as though what's the point of introducing infinite universes? You're just adding so much more complexity. Why not just focus on describing our own universe, right? Like, um, and that's a pretty valid point, I would say. But here is what, like, I guess the proponents of this idea say. Well, they say that we should apply Occam's razor to the rules of the theory, not like not that the fact that it postulates multiple universes, because perhaps the multiverse theory could have a simpler set of rules for all these universes rather than explaining the complex conditions of a single universe. So it's possible that a multiverse could still be simpler, and we shouldn't dismiss it just because we're adding infinite universes, right? So that's also a key idea to keep in mind when we're talking about the multiverse.
So now
So
that
I
we've
guess,
finished,
yeah,
yeah,
now we can move on to, I guess, our discussion section.
and we invite our guest
And
speaker.
yeah, here
Okay.
we'll also have our guest speaker.
So moving on to the discussion section, I have a few questions for our co-host John. First of all, is the universe really fine-tuned for life, where we can exist, or are we simply in one of the few universes where life can even ask such a question?
Well, Carrie, I think that's actually a great question because in history, we humans have a tendency to think we were part of the universe. We're not only the part of the universe, but also the center of the universe, right? Everything revolved around us. And historical maps actually show this, where in the past, Earth was actually depicted as being the center of the solar system, which obviously we know as false today, right? So some people argue that the existence of perfect constants, such as the gravitational constant and etc., such as the existence of water and how it gave rise to life so perfectly, is proof that our universe was actually man-made for the existence of life. However, there's one crucial flaw in this, is that the only reason we are here today is because of these conditions, right? And if we take a look at it, the entire universe, the observable universe currently, we don't see any other planets with life. So it just might have been a coincidence that we have these values on Earth, right? To allow for the existence of life of our kind. Because if conditions didn't allow for this, life might not exist on Earth at all. Or there might be a different form of life on Earth. So we would be unable to comment on these perfect metrics currently, right? So for that reason, these conditions on Earth may seem perfect as though they're made for life to exist, right, Carrie? However, um, the flaw is that we the flaw is that we are made here only because of these conditions, right? And we don't see that happening commonly across the entire observable universe.
I want to add to that, John. I think what you're saying is called the anthropic principle. So what that means is the only our observation is biased. So the only reason we look around and like, oh, look, there's life everywhere around us, everything's so perfect. It's only because we actually exist, right? So we can never see a universe or a universe without life because we wouldn't exist to see it. So you see how it's our observation is dependent on us living. So there's that idea that we're biased in seeing a perfect universe because if we didn't see it as perfect, we wouldn't be alive. So
Exactly.
what do you think of that idea?
I agree with you actually. Humans do have a ton of bias because as humans, it's extremely difficult to perceive situations from a different point of view or perspective, right? Because every day we live within ourselves and we observe through our very own eyes. Um, any empathizing or attempt to be made to observe from a different perspective is still within our own imagination, within our mind, which is shaped by our past experiences and our personal beliefs, right? So whatever we do for humans is extremely difficult, or almost one would say impossible, for us to understand different perspectives completely. Therefore, giving rise to the bias you mentioned.
Also, I want to bring up a past point that you brought up of how there's only life on Earth. We haven't found any other life forms on neighboring planets. If you think in an interstellar age, if we were to go explore farther reaches of our solar system and we found a multitude of life, perhaps even thriving on different planets, would you reconsider your stance about the universe being not fine-tuned for life?
Oh, is that your stance, John? That it's not fine-tuned for
My
life?
sense is that it is
Okay.
not fine-tuned for
Okay.
life, but life simply exists in the container that we call the universe. So I want to address Carrie's hypothetical scenario where we could travel infinitely and we could potentially see like a planet with plentiful life and thriving life, right? So my answer to that is perhaps a little bit. It depends on the extent in which we actually see that happen, right? So one planet with life does not prove much, right?
Yeah.
A lot of planets, like a large percentage base of planets that contain life, might change things, however, right? So the thing is, like you mentioned before, there's probability, right? And since the universe is, quite frankly, infinite to our observations, right? Not our observations.
Like I mean, yeah, it appears it appears
Infinite
that
relevant to
because we can't
our
see past the observable universe, so like we're kind of in the dark there. Is that what you're like talking about? Like so
like it's relative. It's like relatively infinite. Like, yeah, of course, it's not actually like we don't know
it's
if it's
probably we
actually
don't know the
infinite.
size of the total the entire universe.
It's like the size of like us or like our planet.
Yeah.
Yeah, the size of the universe might as well be infinite to us, as we are quite insignificant compared to the universe, right? So with infinity comes probability, and the chance that life occurs due to a set of perfect conditions always has a probability, and it's never zero. So considering an infinite universe, it is actually reasonable to assume
I
that
see.
we do find certain life outside of Earth. However, we either have not explored far enough right now, or we don't have the technological capabilities to actually detect other life forms outside of Earth.
Wow, that's a great point you made there, John. But the idea of fine tune for life, what I wanted to add there was a lot of the constants, like for example, in what we know for physics, like the gravitational constant, is a very specific value. Even if you changed it by a very little bit, 0.001, you know, the planets would no longer be attracted to each other. Everything would change. Like in terms of like even maybe even atoms may no longer have be attracted if you change the electromagnetic force just by a little bit, right? Or certain constants relevant. So what I'm saying is almost our universe might not have even supported any life at all if those constants hadn't been so perfect, right? So, in my opinion, I still feel like the universe was fine tuned in that sense, even if it gives rise to like one species as we only, or like one a human species or life on Earth as we know. So,
Right, that's an amazing perspective. I do understand where you're coming from. But then again, when the scope of what you're mentioning here is kind of restricted to the
Yes.
Earth, right? Because the gravitational constant is only relative to our Earth,
Yes.
right? So that comes down to probability again.
Yes.
I'm sure there are hundreds, if not millions, of planets out in our observable universe that do not have the correct conditions, like you mentioned. Like if even a gravity that was off by certain decimal places, similar to Earth, that did not allow for life, right? But the thing with probability is that given enough time
Yes.
and enough
Yes.
occurrences, it's bound to repeat,
Oh, I see.
right?
That makes sense. Very similar to the Quilted Multiverse idea that Carrie
Yeah, the
mentioned. Right?
level
So
one.
I see. Right? If we have an infinite universe, we'll get repetitions of like different combinations, right? So that was a great, I guess, discussion for our first question. Now, why don't we move on to our next question, Carrie?
So, do you believe personally in any of the multiverse theories that we have explained previously?
Like, in other words, do you believe a multiverse is possible,
Yeah, so
or is it just like science fiction or something like the public likes to fascinate about? I guess.
I don't like to say it's either because they seem quite like black and white answers.
Yeah.
And we know in life that simply isn't true.
Good point, right?
So first of all, as in for the possibility of multiverse, it depends on the factual correctness of the factuality of other theories, right? Because the concept of the multiverse is actually based upon multiple theories, right?
Yeah.
And we have yet to confirm those theories yet, right? So we can't get a solid verdict on whether there would be multiverses or there shouldn't be, right? So there are a couple options to explore. First of all, right, we know due to quantum principle that there are random results, right? So that
Yes.
kind of leads us to the question here: how much can we actually predict, right? So let's take an example here. We have a child swinging on the swing, right? With physics, we can accurately predict the speed in which the child swings down,
Yeah.
the time at which it arrives, right? On a large
Full
scale,
classical
right? Yeah,
mechanics.
classical mechanics right there. If we go to something a little bit more complex, right? We go like a gumball machine. If you knew all the information in the world, would you be able to predict which gumball comes out next,
I think
Yeah,
we should.
certainly.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
right? So here comes the situation.
Hmm.
If you knew everything that you could have known,
Right.
so you knew every piece of data, every piece of information you could use, could we determine
Yeah.
what was going to happen for every single thing in the universe, right?
That's nice. That goes
Yeah.
of determinism versus free will. There's that idea.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I see.
So
At least in my opinion, I would say no because quantum mechanics introduces that inherent uncertainty that you can never, I guess, calculate.
right,
Currently, with our laws that we know.
but here is where the past divide.
Oh yeah, if we were talking about the quantum multiverse, eh?
Right. So for the quantum, some people believe they're obviously it's a random probability, right? But as soon as one path is realized, the
Yeah.
other path disappears,
Yeah.
right? That's one interpretation. But another interpretation is that for the quantum mechanics there, once one path is chosen, the other path is also
Yeah,
chosen,
but just
but in a different universe,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Simply secluded from the other with no interaction whatsoever, right? So, for that to actually be real, right? There would have to be existences of parallel universes in
Exactly.
which every action branches off into a new universe, right? Where
Yes.
outcomes are different. There are a couple other theories about the existence of a multi-universe,
Yeah.
such as string theory.
Yeah.
So the thing is, multi-universes do not have to be pictured in the classical way
Yeah.
in which we have two different paths, like in the quantum one I just described. Right?
Yes.
We can have multiple
I mean,
dimensions,
that's a very good nice
right?
way of saying.
So we know that we live in a three-dimensional world currently, but we don't know, excluding time, of course, we don't know if there's a fourth dimension
Yeah.
or a fifth dimension, right?
Spatial dimension,
Or
right? That's what.
yeah, spatial dimension going up and up, right? All the way to 10 dimension,
Yeah.
which would actually validate string theory. Um, so here's the thing. Here's what scientists argue, right? In our three-dimensional world, 3D objects cast a 2D shadow,
Yeah.
S-
right?
So if you go higher in
Yeah,
dimensions, they
for
would
the
cast
object would
Yeah,
cast.
right. And it would make sense to extend that so 2D objects cast a 1D shadow.
Yeah,
But if we do it extended the other way, we see that a 3D world could actually be the shadow of a 4D world, right?
exactly.
But we would be unable to interact with the 4D world, right? Because
Yeah,
how
definitely.
would a shadow interact with depth? It's impossible, right? So the existence of a 4D world could be very much possible. We just can't interact with it, right? And hence comes the difficulty with proving such a thing, in which do we know that it exists or do we not know that it
Exactly. It's
exists?
That's a
really
It's
really nice
impossible,
connection,
right?
it's
actually.
really hard. That's one of, I guess, the ideas of like falsifiability. Like many criticize the multiverse, saying it's too like out there, abstract. We can never actually test it, so it feels
Exactly.
unscientific to them.
Yeah.
But I still feel, in my opinion, that there's still theories we can test, like inflation, for example, which would give us insight indirectly into the multiverse. So I still feel like it's grounded in reality. So it's a bit harder to access, right?
Yeah, like all the theories we've mentioned, and even ones we haven't mentioned, they're all based on fundamental physics laws, or even basic assumptions like space is infinite. And so, based on that, you could theoretically prove the existence of a multiverse.
Yeah.
But personally, in my opinion, I don't think they're too feasible. And even if they were to exist, in my opinion, I wouldn't pay much attention to them. They wouldn't
I
have
see.
much impact on my own decisions.
Oh, I see.
Okay, Carrie, I don't agree with that point actually, personally. Um, in terms of the application of actually delving into this investigation, right? The main point being that you've previously talked about free will and its connections to the existence of multiple universes, right? So this actually lets us know whether our life is predetermined or whether we actually have the ability to make choices, right? Um, if indeed it was similar to the first path as I described,
Yeah.
um,
The quantum one,
Yeah.
where it branches off.
yeah, where it branches off there, um, where you would have different paths, right? Then you would actually have free will in choosing, right? Because it influences what actually happens after. However, if supposedly you had all the information you can make, like you could use to make a decision on any prediction, and you could theoretically make an accurate prediction,
Hmm.
that would fundamentally mean that there would be no free will, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
if you can predict everything that happens, that means what me and you are doing right now was already set in stone
Exactly. Yeah.
the moment the universe
Yeah,
is born, right?
yeah, so yeah, I hear you're saying. I think that's really similar to the hidden variable interpretation of quantum mechanics, where we just don't have enough information, but given extra information, some variable we don't know of, then we can predict even quantum outcomes with certainty. So that's why no one actually knows whether our universe is deterministic or there's still free will.
Exactly.
But I guess now I'd like to kind of like conclude our discussion. So in terms of what we've talked about, like now going back to the original question, I know you said there's no black and white answer to the multiverse being real, right? Like yes or no. But essentially, like you were investigating, like looking at the like different multiverse theories. But I want to ask one more time, like what's your stance, I guess, on this idea of the multiverse, just as a whole?
My stance on whether the existence of multiverses is irrelevant.
Is relevant?
It's relevant,
Yes.
or in it, or if it
Yeah.
actually,
It does it exist? Yeah.
if it actually exists, right? That's your question.
Yeah, as it exists. Of course, we'll never know for sure, but like, even like just your opinion, is it like possible for it to exist, or is it like just too out there and like makes no sense at all, right?
Or like we
So,
can never prove that it even exists.
yeah,
Do you believe we can prove it in the future as well?
I do believe, yeah, because one thing you never know what the future
yeah,
may
exactly.
hold,
That's
right?
the
Oh
idea,
yeah.
Fred.
Like you gotta think about how in the past, when humans did not travel through the water, we were restricted by the island.
Exactly.
That's the entire world we knew, right? The science that suggests that there is a possibility, whether that be a logical argument, whether that be a numerical argument, or philosophical, It's whether the
Philosophical.
philosophical argument. It all indicates a possibility, right? And we're still actually really early as a species because most of our development actually happened very recently in the
Yeah.
recent 1% of the time, the
Yeah,
total
the
time
entire
the tree
time.
existed, right?
Yeah.
So if I were to arrive at a definitive conclusion on whether multiverses actually exist, I would optimistically say yes.
I would also agree. I think it's possible.
Yeah, I think I've had my opinion changed as well. We never know what's going to happen in the
Sure.
future. And I would also agree that, yes, the multiverse does exist, and hopefully we can prove that in the future as well.
Yeah, so that was, I guess, like a great discussion. Now we'll move on to our conclusion section. Okay, so let's start off with like a recap of what we've talked about. We've looked at the Max. We looked at Max Tegmark's like, hierarchy of the multiverses, like the Quilted Multiverse, inflationary multiverse, the quantum many worlds interpretation, and then finally the mathematical universe hypothesis. And we're going into higher levels of abstractness there. And then philosophically, we looked at the interpretations of like identity and ethics when we introduce a multiverse, and then Occam's razor, whether the multiverse is just unnecessarily complex. And then also for our discussion section, we spoke with John and then got his opinion on whether the universe is fine tuned for life, and I got to hear his opinion on um, his answer of no, right? Like seeing how we haven't seen as much life yet to make that conclusion. Uh, and then our last question right now about our belief on the multiverse existence. And in short, I guess we do believe it, that it's possible that we can prove it in the future. And it's kind of unnecessary to rule it out immediately without the full picture.
So now we've been asking the questions. It's time to ask you guys, the audience, one final question. So it's going to be related with philosophy and self-identity. So if there are doppelgangers of you out there, would you like to know their decisions and their actions, or are those completely meaningless to you? Option A, I would be interested in knowing what they do. Option B, their actions and everything are meaningless to me. We're completely separated. We have two different identities. Or option C, other. So we'd like to thank our
Okay.
guest
Thank you so
speaker
much,
for
John, for
coming,
joining us today.
joining us and giving your very insightful opinion
Yep,
about
no
our
problem.
Yeah.
questions.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great discussing the multiverse with you and learning from your perspective.
You as
Yeah.
well, Sano.
Thank
Yeah.
you
Thank
so
you so much,
much.
John.
Thank you for having me.
So everyone, remember
Yeah.
to like and subscribe
Subscribe and
and
see
see
you
you
all
all
next
next
time.
time.